B'siyata d'shmaya, we're going to learn Yoma Daf Nun. We're going to start 11 lines from the top of the Omad. And this sugya today is bringing us back to the sugya we learned in the middle of Daf Mem Tes Omad base. The Gemara says, the Gemara asked a question, Shochat umeis mahu sheyikonis achir bedomai. If a kohen gadol, he shechted his bull, his parah, which was a chatos, and then this kohen gadol died, and in the meantime the person stirring the blood is still stirring the blood. They now find another kohen gadol, the deputy, who's going to take over from the first kohen gadol. We want to know, the Gemara wants to know and discusses whether this second kohen gadol has to shecht his own bull or whether he can use the blood of the previous kohen gadol's par, his bull. That was the question that the Gemara asked, and we discussed it at the end of yesterday's daf. And now the Gemara is asking a very simple question. V'typically, dechatos shemesu ba'aleohi. We know that there's a halacha l'Moshe Sinai that in 5 situations a korban chatos actually has to be put to death, and it's halacha l'Moshe Sinai. And one of them is a chatos whose owner died before they were makriv, before they finished doing the korban chatos. He died. Here, this par is a korban chatos. Its owner, the kohen gadol, the previous kohen gadol, died. It's a chatos shemesu ba'aleo. V'chatos shemesu ba'aleo lemisa ozlo. We know the halacha l'Moshe Sinai that a chatos shemesu ba'aleo is put to death. You can't use the blood for anything. You can't use that korban for anything. You have to bring a new chatos. Omar le Rovin barav Ada l'Rova. Rovin said to Rava, Omri talmidcha, your talmidim Rava, Omar Rav Amram. They said in the name of Rav Amram. And Rav Amram is going to give an answer which Rava is soon going to challenge. Rav Amram says, you're right, but this chatos actually has the status of a chatos tziburhi. And the halacha l'Moshe Sinai that says that a chatos shemesu ba'aleo is yomus doesn't apply to chatos tzibur. Since it's a chatos tziburi, and therefore it does not have to be put to death, and therefore the question stands in its place: can the second kohen gadol use it or not? Ditnan. We learnt in a brisa. Omalei Reb Meir. Reb Meir said, "V'haloi par yom haKippurim." And who was Reb Meir speaking to or about? There was a Tana Kama. The Chachamim said that there's a rule: a korban tzibur is doicha Shabbos and doicha Tumah. A korban yochid is not doicha Shabbos and not doicha Tumah. So Rabbi asked on that, I have 3 different korbanos who are definitely doicha Shabbos, and we assume that it's a korban yochid. And that's against what you Tanakama say, that a korban yochid is not doicha Shabbos. V'haloi par yom haKippurim. This is our par, this par of the kohen gadol, as being one. V'chavitei kohen gadol, and the mincha the kohen gadol has to bring every day. V'pesach, and the korban pesach. The korban yochitu, that these 3, Reb Meir says, are a korban yochid, v'doiches ha-Shabbos, v'es ha-Tumah, and they override Shabbos and Tumah. And you, Chachomim, you said that any korban yochid does not override Shabbos and Tumah. So that was what Rabbi Meir said to the Chachomim. Michlal, lav, can we not assume that Michlal, de'ika leman de'omar de'tzibur, that the reason that the Rabbanon said, they did say their rule, that a korban yochid is not doicha Shabbos and Tumah, and these 3 are doicha Shabbos and Tumah, par yom haKippurim, chavitei kohen gadol, and korban pesach, it must be that the Tanakama hold that these 3, including par yom haKippurim, are not a korban yochid, they're a korban tzibur. So from here, Rav Amram brought proof that the par yom haKippurim is considered a korban tzibur. We have to understand that because it belonged exclusively to the kohen gadol. It was his par, he had to pay for it. But we'll see later in the Gemara that because it also atoned for the kohanim, it had the status of a korban tzibur. And the Gemara there is going to discuss it a little bit more in detail, but Rabbi Amram is bringing proof from here that it's true that Rabbi Meir assumed that the par yom haKippurim together with chavitei yom haKippur, a kohen gadol, and the korban pesach are considered a korban yochid, but the Chachamim held it was a korban of a rabbim. Says Rabbi Amram, if it's a rabbim, then the halachas of chatos shemesu ba'aleo do not apply. That is what Harovin quoted Rav Amram as answering the question. And here Rava is challenging that. Ulatamech, Rava says, if that's the way that you're understanding Reb Meir's pose against the Tanakama, Diktani, this that we learned in a Brisa, there was somebody else who also asked a question against those same Tanakama. The same Tanakama that said that a korban tzibur is doicher Shabbos and doicher Tumah, and a korban yochid is not doicher Shabbos and not doicher Tumah. Reb Meir asked a question from 3 korbanos yochid, which are doicher Shabbos and doicher Tumah. Rabbi Yaakov is now going to ask from 3 korbanos, which are not doicher Shabbos and not doicher Tumah, and they seem to be korban tzibur, which is yet another question against that Tanakama. Omalei Rabbi Yaakov said to the Chachomim, V'aloi par helam dovo shel tzibur. We're not going now into the details what these korbanos are. Later in Shas we're going to learn about them more. But there's a korban called a par helam dovar shel tzibur, which is clearly a korban tzibur. U'si'iri avodas kechovim, and another type of korban called si'iri avodas kechovim. Again, we're not going to discuss that now. V'chagiga, or the korban chagiga, where these 3 are all korban to korban tzibur, ve'ein doichin lo yesa Shabbos v'lo yesa Tumah. And Rabbi Yaakov says that, you see here, not like you Tanakama said that korban tzibur is doicha Shabbos and doicha Tumah. Here we have 3 korbanos tzibur which are korban tzibur, and they're not doicha Shabbos and they're not doicha Tumah. So Rav is asking to Ravin, are you going to also say, as you said before, Michlal de'ikar leman de'omar de'yachid, that the reason that the Tanakama do not have an issue with this is because they say that these 3 are considered a korban yachid, and that's why they don't be doichet Tumah and Shabbos? You can't say that. Par helam dovo shel tzibur and si'iri avodas kechovim, everybody agrees, it's explicit in the Torah that they are a korbanos tzibur. So you see that the fact that Rabbi Yaakov asked a question like this doesn't mean that the Chachomim held it was a korban yachid. If so, going back to Reb Meir, when Reb Meir asked his question against the Tanakama by saying, how can you Tanakama say that a korban yachid is not doicha Shabbos and not doicha Tumah? And he asked a question from Pariyei Makipurim, which is a korban yachid and is doicha Shabbos and Tumah. Don't deduce from there that the Chachomim must hold that it's derabim. And if you don't deduce from there that the Chachomim say it's derabim, then you have no proof or source that Pariyei Makipurim is considered a korban tzibur. And if you don't have such a source, then the answer that Ravin quoted from Rav Amram doesn't stand anymore, because Rav Amram brought proof that it's a chatos tzibur, and therefore the halachas of chatos shemesu ba'aleo do not apply. If you don't have proof to this, then the question comes back, or at least it could be that this chatos of the Pariyei Makipurim is considered a korban yochid, and therefore chatos shemesu ba'aleo is yomus. And then the question comes back, how could the second Kohen Gadol, how can we even entertain the idea of the second Kohen Gadol using the power of the first Kohen Gadol? It's a chatos shemesu ba'aleo. Elo, Rava says, in order to explain Reb Meir and Rabbi Yaakov, that Rava says something very different. Elo letanakama komahadurle. The Reb Meir and Rabbi Yaakov were responding to the Tanakama and were saying, Deshome, they heard the Tanakama say, the Ka'omar, korban tzibur doiches Shabbos v'esatuma, the korban yochid einu doiches lois Shabbos v'lois atuma. You Tanakama seem to have a rule that korban tzibur overrides Shabbos and Tumah. Korban Yochid doesn't. Omalei Reb Meir then responded to the Tanakama and said, Korban Yochid, klolahu? Do you have such a rule that whenever it's a Korban Yochid, it's not doicha Shabbos or Tumah? V'haloi Pariyei Makipurim, v'chavitei Kohen Gadol, u'Pesach, the 3 that Reb Meir mentioned, the Korban Yochid, who that everybody agrees, even you Rabbanon agree it's a Korban Yochid. So it cannot be just a rule, anything which is korban yochid is not doicha Shabbos and Tumah. That's not always true. And in a similar theme, Rabbi Yaakov said to the Chachomim, korban tzibur klolahi, are you saying a rule that any korban tzibur is doicha Shabbos and Tumah? Haloi, the 3 that he mentioned, par helam dovo shel tzibur, u'si'iri avodas kechovim v'chagiga, that the korban tzibur, who everybody agrees, even you Rabbanon agree, that it's considered a korban tzibur, ve'ein doichen lo yisa Shabbos v'lo yisa Tumah. So we have an issue here that you Chachomim, you seem to say a rule that was across the board. We have a number of exceptions. So rather, the rule, and this is how Rav is understanding this, the rule of determining what overrides Shabbos or Tumah, it goes a bit differently. Kol shezmanoi kavua, anything whose time is fixed, any korban who has a fixed time, doiches haShabbos v'haTumah, it overrides Shabbos and Tumah, afilu b'yochid, even if it's korban yochid, like Pariyei Makipurim, or Chavitei Kohen Gadol, or the korban Pesach, which are considered korban yochid, but zmanui kavua, it's a fixed time, and therefore it overrides Shabbos and Tumah. V'chol she'ein zmanui kavua, but any korban whose time is not fixed, it does not override Shabbos or Tumah, afilu b'tzibur, and therefore the par helam dova shel tzibur, se'iri avodas kichovim, and chagiga, where all of these do not have a fixed time, chagiga can be brought in the days, doesn't have to be on Shabbos, and therefore they do not override Tumah and Shabbos. So at this point, we just had a big machlekas, or a big discussion here. Rav Amram assumed that the Chachomim who argue with Reb Meir, they say that Par Yom Kippurim is a korban tzibur, and Rava said no. Rava said everybody agrees that Par Yom Kippurim is not considered a korban tzibur. What's the difference if it's a korban tzibur or not, is our discussion here. If the Par Yom Kippurim is a korban tzibur, then the halachas of Chatos Shemesu Ba'aleo do not apply, and the previous Gemara is understood. According to Rava, who says that Par Yom Kippurim is a korban yochid, then the previous Gemara is not understood. The question comes back, since it's a korban of a yochid, and if it's korban of a yochid, then the halachas of Chatos Shemesu Ba'aleo apply, and there should be no good reason that the second Kohen Gadol can use the par of the first Kohen Gadol. Continues the Gemara, Eis ve'Abaya. Abaya is now asking a question against Rava. We just now saw that Rava said that there's no proof at all that anybody actually holds that par of Yom Kippurim is a korban tzibur. It could well be that everybody agrees it's a korban yochid. Well, this seems to be a contradiction from the following brisa. What does it say in the brisa? Par v'so'ir shel Yom Kippurim, the bull or the goat of Yom Kippur, she'ovdu. What happens if they got lost? They brought a replacement, and they offered up the replacement, and afterwards they found the original ones. Kulam yamusu. Then those original ones that now got found, they have to be put to death, because this is another one of the halachas that of a chatos, sheniskapru ba'aleim, a chatos whose owners had already been atoned for, they also have to be yamusu. Which is another korban, which is also she'ovdu v'hifresh acherim tachteim kulam yamusu. Divrei Rabbi Yehuda says that all these three, the par and the soyer Yom Kippurim and the seirei avodas kichavim, all these three, if it's the status of niskapru ba'aleim yamusu, they have to be put to death. Rabbi Elazar, Rabbi Shimon Oimrim, they argue and they say yiru. You have to let them graze until they get a mum, v'yimkuru, and then you can sell them, v'yiplu dameim le'nedava, and the money is used for the nedava. It's used to buy korbanos for the kaitz hamizbeach, as oilos to be put on the mizbeach when there was a lack of korbanos. She'ein chatos tzibur mesa. Why? Because these three are considered chatos tzibur, and since it's a chatos tzibur, the halach l'Moshe Messinais don't apply, and therefore even a chatos sheniskapru ba'aleo, that doesn't apply by a chatos tzibur. And we see you've got the par. One of these three is the par of the Yom Kippurim, which according to Rabbi Elazar and Rabbi Meir is considered a chatos of a tzibur. And since it's a chatos tzibur, it doesn't get put to death. And that's why Yiru Achiestavu, etc. So how can you rather say that there's no Tana that says that a par of Yom Kippurim is considered a korban tzibur? Here you have Rabbi Elazar and Rabbi Shimon. Omar le. So Rava answered to Abaya, says, look carefully at the brisa. It actually doesn't say par shel Yom Kippurim. What does it say? It says par v'soir shel Yom Kippurim. So you know what the par means? Don't say it's par of Yom Kippurim. My par, what's the par? Par he'elam dovo shel tzibur. It's a different bull, a different korban, which there everybody agrees it's a par he'elam dovo shel tzibur. Again, we're not going into the details of these korbanos, but it's a par which is a chatos of a tzibur. Does it not say in the Brisa Shel Yom HaKippurim of Yom Kippur? How can you say that it means a par he'elam dovo shel tzibur, which has nothing to do with Yom Kippur, if it says par v'soyer de Yom HaKippurim? Says the Gemara, Kikatoni ad the soyer. The words de Yom HaKippurim is only referring to the soyer, and the soyer of Yom Kippur is definitely a korban of a tzibur, as is the soyer of Avodas Kechavim. So the way you read the Brayah says par, and soyer de Yom HaKippurim, and soyer of Avodas Kechavim, and the par is the par he'elam dovo. All three are talking about a korban of a tzibur, and since a korban tzibur, you don't say that it's a chatos sheniskapru baleim is mesos, and that's how Rabbi Elazar and Rabbi Shimon say that they're not mesos. And then, so according to Rava, again, there's no Tana in this brisa that actually speaks about the par of the Kohen Gadol, saying that it's a korban tzibur, and it could well be a korban of a yachid. Says the Gemara, I'll ask you from another brisa. V'atanya, and in this brisa it's explicit, par shel Yom HaKippurim, the bull of the Kohen Gadol of Yom Kippur, v'soyer shel Yom HaKippurim, or the soyer of Yom HaKippurim, she'avdu, they got lost, v'hifresh achirim tachtem, kulam yamusu divrei Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Elazar, Rabbi Shimon, oimrim yirat, she'istavu, v'yimkru, v'yiplu domeim l'nedava, she'ein chatos tzibur meisa. Again, as we saw before, that according to Rabbi Yehuda, they get put to death. According to Rabbi Elazar and Rabbi Shimon, they say that they do not get put to death because it's korban tzibur, and since it's a chatos of a tzibur, you don't say that chatos sheniskapru ba'aleim meisais. So if so, here again we have an explicit brayso that refers explicitly to the power of the Yom HaKippurim, and you say that according to Rabbi Elazar and Rabbi Shimon, you're saying that it's a korban tzibur, not like Rava said before that according to everybody that it's a korban of a yachid. Says the Gemara that over here we cannot manipulate the beginning of the brayso like we did before. Before we said that par doesn't mean par of Yom HaKippurim. You cannot do that here because it says explicitly par of Yom HaKippurim. But what we can do is we can somewhat tweak the reasoning that when Rabbi Elazar and Rabbi Shimon said that you don't say mesos, rather you let it graze, get a blemish, sell it, and use the money for the nedava. Don't say that the reason is because ein chatos tzibur mesa. And that was our proof that they hold that the power of Yom HaKippurim is a chatos tzibur. No, let's tweak that a bit. Lo teima she'ein chatos tzibur mesa. Elo eima say she'ein chatos hashutfin mesa. When it says tzibur, it doesn't mean a tzibur as in a whole congregation. It means partners. Since the power of Yom HaKippurim has the status of partners, and with partners, there the halacha is that we do not say that chatos sheniskapru ba'aleim is mesos. So it could well be that according to Rabbi Elazar and Rabbi Shimon, like Rava said before, it's a korban yochid, it's not a korban tzibur. If it's a korban yochid, then, but it belongs to shutfin, then even though it's a korban yochid, we do not say that a chatos sheniskapru ba'aleim is mesos, and that's why they say that you don't need to put this korban to death. But what's happened now, we have a whole new picture in Rava. Till now we assumed that Rava said that the power of Yom HaKippurim is a korban yachid. And in contrast to what Rav Amram said, that he had proof that there were opinions that it's a korban tzibur. And Rav Amram said it's a korban tzibur, and therefore the power of the Kohen Gadol being a korban tzibur, you don't say chatos shemeisu ba'aleo, and therefore the Gemara can rightfully discuss whether a different Kohen Gadol can use the same power. However, according to Rava, who said that it's a korban yochid chatos shemeisu ba'aleo mesos, and therefore there's no way a second Kohen Gadol can use the original bull of the original Kohen Gadol. But now that Rava from this brisa is forced to say that it's not a korban tzibur, but it's a korban of shutfim. And a korban of shutfim, we don't say that the chatos sheniskapru ba'aleo mesos, nor do we say chatos shemeisu ba'aleo. If the power of Yom HaKippurim is considered a par and bull of shutfin, of partners, because the other kohanim are partners with him, they're being atoned with him? If so, we now have a similar answer to Rav Amram. We asked a question before, how can you discuss whether a second kohen gadol can use the original bull? It's chatos shemesu ba'aleo, and Rav Amram said it's a chatos tzibur, and you don't say by chatos tzibur, chatos shemesu ba'aleo is lemisa, but according to Rava, he says it's a chatos of a yochid, but shel shutfin, of partners. And by partners, you also don't say chatos shemesu ba'aleo. So exactly the same way as Rav Amram had an answer, so Rava will now have the same answer. He's got every right to argue with Rav Amram and say it's not called a tzibur, it's not called a korban of a rabbim, it's a korban of a yochid, but it's shutfin. And as soon as it's shutfin, then it has the same effect as Rav Amram, as a tzibur, that in both the shutfin and the tzibur, you don't say chatos shemesu ba'aleo is lemisa. And therefore, the Gemara before is well understood, even according to Rava. So if so, the Gemara says, so the Gemara is now asking, Umay nafka minna, why are you challenging Rav Amram? Why is it so important for you to say, Rav Amram, don't say that para of the kohen gadol is a chatos of a tzibur. No. Say it's chatos of shutfin. Okay, fine, so call it shutfin. What are you trying to gain? Either way, we don't say chatos shemesu ba'aleo is lemisa, and either way, the second kohen gadol could well use the original par. Why are you challenging of Amram? Answers the Gemara, a very interesting answer. The Gemara says, I have a side reason, I have an interest to make sure that nobody should think that this par belongs to a tzibur. Even though I agree with Amram, we asked a question, how can the Gemara discuss the second kohen gadol using the original par? It's a chatos shemesu ba'aleo. I agree with Amram that it's not a question because we don't say chatos shemesu ba'aleo here. Not because of what Rav Amram said as korban tzibur, rather because it's a korban of a yochid but of two partners. I agree with him. But the reason it's important for me to undermine what he said, that it's a korban of a tzibur, is because what would make it a tzibur? The fact that all the kohanim are being atoned by this par. In the same way as I rather say that it's called a korban of a shutfus, of partnership, because all the kohanim are partners and being atoned. But it's important for me that no one should think that the kohanim as a group are considered a tzibur. Because if anyone's going to think that the shevet of kahuna, the kohanim, are considered a tzibur, then they might think that they are called a kohol, and a congregation, halachically defined kohol, and the truth is they're not a kohol, because only people that actually inherited parts in Eretz Yisrael are called a kohol. Shevet Levi didn't. And if people are going to think that because we're calling the power of the kohen gadol, who atoned for all the kohanim, if people are going to call it a korban tzibur, they're going to think that the kahuna, the Shevet Levi, is considered a kohol. And if they're going to say that, then the loimaisi kohanim par b'hira. There's a separate type of korban which is only brought when a kohol gets misled by a mistaken ruling of a Beis Din, and only if a whole kohol, if one of the other tribes, one of the other shvatim get misled, you have to bring this korban of that the Gemara is speaking about here. However, if just the kohanim get misled, they are not called a kohol. So in order that people shouldn't make the mistake thinking that the kohanim are considered a kohol, Rava went out against Rav Amram to make sure that nobody calls the power of the kohen gadol a korban of a tzibur. Continues the Gemara, we're going to ask another question against Rava. That you, Rava, you say that the power of the kohen gadol is not a korban tzibur. It's first you said it was a korban yochid, then you tweaked it a little bit because of that last brisa, and you said it's a shutfus, it's a partnership of a number of yechidim, but not of a rabbim. In contrast to Rav Amram, who said that the Chachamim must hold that power of Yom Kippurim is called a korban of a tzibur, of a rabbim. And we're going to have a question on this. Tashema, Dubai Rebbe Loza. Rebbe Loza asked, Ledivrei, according to Reb Meir, Ha'omer, who, as we saw before, who challenged the Chachamim, and he holds, and only Reb Meir holds, Par Yom Kippurim is korban yochid. According to Reb Meir, that the Par Yom Kippurim is considered a korban yochid, then oiset tmura, or eino oiset tmura. then can that par Yom Kippurim make a Tmura? What's a Tmura? A Tmura is when somebody tries to replace a korban on a different animal. He tries to say that the kedusha of one korban, one animal, should go onto another animal. The halacha is the kedusha stays on the original animal, and the second animal has its own kedusha. V'hoyahu utmurasu yeh kodesh. They're both kodesh, with a lot of halachas of Tmura. There's a whole Masechet Tmura dedicated to this later on in Shas. But so Rabbi Loza was asking, according to Reb Meir, who says that the power of the Yom Kippurim is considered a korban yochid. We know that regular korban yochid, the halachas of Tmura apply to it. The question is, does it even apply here? And we'll soon see in the Gemara exactly what he was contemplating. But either way, from the formula that Rabbi Loza used, L'divrei ha'omer, according to the opinion that Par Yom Kippurim is a korban yochid, it seems to be that according to the Chachomim, it's not a korban yochid. Lav michlal de'ikar leman da'amad tzibur. Can we not understand from Rabbi Loza's words that according to the Chachomim, the power of Yom Kippurim is actually a korban of a rabbim, not like Rava assumed? Says the Gemara, Loi. No, you're right that you can deduce from the words of Rabbi Loza that Reb Meir is the one that says that power of Yom Kippurim is a korban yochid, but the others argue and say it's not yochid, but that doesn't mean it's of a rabbim, of a tzibur. That those who argued with Reb Meir, they hold that it has the status of shutfin, of partners. And then that's very good. That's exactly what Rava says. Rava said, from that brayso we mentioned on Amud Aleph, that the power of Yom Kippurim is considered a power, a chatos belonging to shutfim, to partners. So that's as far as the questions against Rava are concerned. We've answered them all. So we have Reb Meir who says that power Yom Kippurim is shel yachid, and we have Rav Amram who says that the Chachomim who argued with Reb Meir say that power Yom Kippurim is a power of a tzibur, of a rabbim. We have Rava who said there's no such thing. First we thought that according to Rava, everybody assumes it's a yachid, and then afterwards Rava changed that to say that there are opinions who hold that Rabbi Loza and Reb Shimon, who they hold that the power of Yom Kippurim is a korban belonging to shutfim. And now the Gemara continues. Gufa, we want to discuss what was the doubt of Rabbi Loza. Rabbi Loza, he asked a question that the power of Yom Kippurim, according to the opinion that, according to Reb Meir, that says it's a korban yachid, and Tosfos discusses exactly how that interferes with Rabbi Loza's suffix. But Rabbi Loza asked, the power of Yom Kippurim, does it make a tmura? Does it not make a tmura? Boy, Rabbi Loza, l'divrei ha'omer par Yom Kippurim korban yachid, oiseh tmura or ein oiseh tmura? Do the halachas of tmura apply to it? We know that a korban belonging to a tzibur, to a rabbim, halachas of Tmura do not apply. A korban belonging to shutfim, the halachas of Tmura do not apply. The question is, according to Reb Meir, do the halachas of Tmura apply or not? Asks the Gemara, Maikami Boile, I don't understand. What's the question? Everybody knows that all the other kohanim are being atoned from this korban. That means that they must have some share in this korban, and any korban that doesn't belong to a single individual, Tmura, the halachas of Tmura do not apply. What was Rabbi Loza's question? Answers the Gemara. The question is, Ibasa makdish as linon. Do we look at this korban as being a korban yachid because it belonged exclusively to the Kohen Gadol? Ibasa miskaper as linon. Or do we look at this power, Yom Kippurim, as we look at it from the point of view of those who are being atoned, and indeed many people, many kohanim are being atoned, and if you look at it as far as the shutfin, as far as those who are the miskaprim are concerned, then even though it might be considered a korban yachid, but we will not say tmura, because as far as the miskaprim are concerned, it belongs to all those kohanim who are being atoned. Says the Gemara, that's your suffix. Pshita de basam is kaperos linon. Of course, the halachas of Tmura are dependent on whether this korban had many people being atoned by it or not, and is not dependent on how many people owned and originally made the korban hektish. Hamaktish, if you've got somebody who takes an animal and is makdish it on somebody else's behalf. Reuven takes an animal and says, I want this animal to atone for Shimon. And then the animal gets a mum and a blemish, and you're allowed to then, or you're supposed to redeem it. And the halacha is when you redeem an animal, then you have to add on a chomesh, which is an extra 25%. We've discussed that previously elsewhere. Then hamakdish moisif chomesh, that it's only when the person, the Ruvain, who he made this animal, he wanted it to atone for Shimon, but it was Reuven's animal. It's only if Reuven redeems it that he has to add a chomesh. Were Shimon to redeem it, he's the miskaper, you do not need to add a chomesh. That's the one halacha. V'hamiskaper oisabot tmura. If Shimon were to make it a tmura, since he is the miskaper, he's the one who's going to be atoned by this animal, the halachas of tmura can apply only if he makes the tmura. Were Reuven to try and make a tmura of this animal, the halachas of tmura would not apply. So you see clearly the halachas of tmura are dependent on the miskaper, on the one being atoned, not on the one who actually owned and was makdish the animal. And the third halacha of Rabbi Yochanan was v'atoyrem mishaloi al shel chaveiro. If Reuven takes truma to try and on behalf of the fruits or the vegetables of the produce of Shimon, that means Reuven takes his own fruits and said this should be truma, and Shimon's food will now no longer be tevel. Tevas hana shaloi. It's a Reuven who can choose who to give the truma to. So these are three halachas of Rabbi Yochanan. But what do we see from that second halacha? That the halachas of Tamura are dependent on the miskaper. So how can you, Rabbi Elazar, ask that according to Rabbi Meir, since this korban is, and it's a korban yochid, it belongs exclusively to the kohen gadol, can you do Tamura, can you not do Tamura? And we said that the discussion was, do we look at the miskaprim? And since a lot of people are being atoned by it, it would be called a korban of a shutfin. Or do we look at the makdish, which is just the kohen gadol? We just saw here from Rabbi Yochanan, the halachos of Tamura are always learned and always based on the miskaprim. And since you have many miskaprim, it should have the halachos of a korban of a tzibur, of a shutfin at least, and the Tamura should not apply. What was Rabbi Elazar's question? Says the Gemara, La'olam pshitale de basa miskaper as linon. Rabbi Elazar knew that we view the korban as from the point of view of the miskaprim, those being atoned, and many kohanim are being atoned. The question is, this question was that normally when somebody's being atoned, when Shimon is being atoned by Reuven's animal, Reuven actually makes the animal belong to Shimon so that Shimon can be atoned by it. And then it belongs to, or at least there's a certain kinyan, on some level it belongs to the one who's being niskapir. And if that were true here, then indeed, since there are so many people, since there's many kohanim being atoned, but on this animal it would be called shutfin, and halachos of Tamura would not apply. However, this that all the kohanim are being atoned, is it b'kvi'usa miskapri? Is it like we said before, that is something very fixed, which means that the kohen gadol actually gives part of this animal, so to speak, at least as far as the atonement is concerned, that the animal belongs to the other kohanim and it has the status of shutfin, and Tamura would not apply? Or dilma b'kufya miskapri? Really, this animal belongs only to the kohen gadol, and even as far as atonement is concerned, the primary person, the main person who's getting atonement is only the kohen gadol. The fact that the other kohanim are also being atoned, that's sort of by the way, they're floating along with the kohen gadol, we add them as well, they also get atonement. But it could be that in this case, even though they get atoned by this power, it doesn't mean that the power in any way belongs to them, and therefore it will not be an issue with Tamura. And that was Rabbi Elazar's question. And now we're going to try and bring proof to this, that according to Rabbi Meir, who says that this korban belongs, is considered a korban yochid, but since many of the kohanim are being atoned by it, is it considered an animal of shutfin that you cannot do Tamura or not? We're going to try and bring proof to this from the following brisa. Tashema chaymer bezevach mi betmura v'chaymer betmura mi bezevach. We're now going to learn a brisa which is going to discuss 6 points, 6 aspects, some of which have a chaymer, have a stringency that apply to the original korban. Because what's a Tamura? Tamura says, I want the halachas of the original korban to apply to a different animal. And we say that both korbanos are kodesh, and You don't gain anything by doing that. The Torah doesn't want you to gain by switching Kedusha from one animal to the next. That's the parasha called Tmura. But the Brisa says here that in 4 aspects, the original korban is more stringent, and in 2 aspects, the Tmura korban, the second one, the replacement korban, is more stringent. Chomer bezevach, what's the stringency of the original korban? And we're talking here about a single specific type of korban. We'll soon see what it is. That shazevach noyeg beyochid kebetzibur. We're talking about a type of korban, that the type of korban applies also to a yochid and also to a tzibur. We have to see what that is. It could be a chatos. A chatos, there's a concept of chatos by a yochid and a chatos tzibur. It could be an oila. There's a concept of an oila belonging to a tzibur, an oila belonging to a yochid. We'll see. V'doiches haShabbos. And this, whichever zevach, whichever korban we're talking about, it overrides Shabbos. V'es haTumah, and it also overrides Tumah. And those are attributes and properties of a korban tzibur. V'oise Tmura, and also this particular zevach we're talking about, oise Tmura, the halachos of Tmura apply to it, which means it's a type of korban that also has the properties of a korban yochid, because a korban tzibur doesn't have the halachos of Tmura, don't apply to it. So we have to see what it is, but the stringencies of a zevach, of this particular korban, is these 4 things. Yochid ketzibur, doicha Shabbos, doicha Tumah, and oise Tmura. Masha'ein kein betmura. However, the replacement animal, all these 4 don't apply. There's no such thing as the replacement animal of a korban tzibur. Tmura doesn't apply by korban tzibur. That's the first stringency that doesn't apply. The Tmura korban is never has a fixed time, therefore it's never overrides Shabbos, it never overrides Tumah, and there's a Gzeres HaKosov that says that hu utmurosoi ve'ein tmurosoi letmurosoi, that a Tmura korban cannot be replaced by another Tmura. You can't try and transfer that Kedusha from korban number 2, from animal number 2 to animal number 3. So this concept of oise Tmura applies to the original korban. The original korban has the halachos of Tmura applied to it, that if you try to make the Kedusha of that animal apply to another animal, the halachos of Tmura apply. But regarding that second animal, the halachos of Tmura would not apply. You cannot make a Tmura for that animal. So those are the chomer bezevach. We soon have to see what zevach this is. It's very interesting. It's a type of zevach that's also yochid, also tzibur. It's also doicha Shabbos and Tumah, and also oise Tmura. We have to try and work out what on earth can that be. They seem to be these properties are contradicting each other. We'll soon see. What's the chomer betmura mibezevach? What are the 2 stringencies that apply to Tmura? Number 1, Tmura cholo al balmum kavua. Normally, a regular korban, if you have a korban, an animal that has a balmum, has a fixed blemish, Masechet B'chayros will see exactly what's called a balmum kavua. But if it has a fixed, unhealable blemish, and you make it into a korban, then the Kedushas Haguf will never apply to it. It will never become, in essence, a korban. It will become hektish. It will become Kedushas Domim. It will belong to the Beis Hamikdash. It will be used for the Beis Hamikdash. But because it has a blemish, it will not become a korban. However, a Tmura, there we learn from Psukim that a Kedushas Haguf can apply to that second animal, even if it has a fixed blemish. And also, there's another stringency. In the event that you were to redeem a korban, a regular korban that needs to be redeemed, then even though you can redeem it in order to be able to eat it. But you cannot afterwards, even after it's been redeemed, you cannot work with it, you cannot share it. However, that's only true for the Tmura animal. However, the original korban, this doesn't apply. The original korban, there in most cases, once you redeem it, it goes out completely lechulin. Only a Tmura animal doesn't go out. That means these 2 chumras. Number 1, that the Kedusha can apply even if it's a balmum. And number 2, after you redeem it, you're not allowed to work with it or shear it, that only applies to the Tmura animal, to the second animal. It does not apply to the original animal. And we're going to see more about that soon. So that is the end of the Brisa. Masha'inkin bezevach, but a regular zevach, the original korban, these two stringencies don't apply. So now the Gemara is asking, Hai zevach, this one korban that has these 6 properties, yachid ketzibur, it overrides Shabbos, it overrides Tumah, it can make a Tmura, it does not, the Kedushas Haguf will not apply to it if it has a mum kavua before it became hekdesh. And when you redeem it, you're even allowed to share and work with it. Which is the one korban that all those 6 halachas would apply to? Heichadami, ilay mediyachid. If it's a type of korban which has the status of a korban yachid, midachi Shabbos v'tumah. How can it override Shabbos and Tumah? We know that a korban yachid generally does not override Shabbos and Tumah. Elo de tzibur. You're talking about a korban tzibur, mi'osa tmura. Then we know that a korban tzibur, halachas of tmura do not apply. And here we said that this zevach, whichever the zevach is oisa tmura. So we're going to have 4 different suggestions, which is the one zevach that all these halachas can apply to. So what is the first, and what is the Gemara saying? Elolav, it must be that the par. We're talking about which type of korban is a korban chatos. Korban chatos applies on yochid ketzibur. Which korban chatos are we talking about? Which is the one korban which is doicha Shabbos, doicha Tumah, and oisa tmura, etc. It must be the par. It must be this chatos, which is the bull, the chatos of the Kohen Gadol on Yom Kippur. That on the one hand, it's v'doiches haShabbos, v'doiches haTumah dekviyah leizman. It's a korban yachid, but it has a fixed time, and we saw before if it has a fixed time, it overrides Shabbos and Tumah. V'oisa tmura, and nonetheless, the halachas of tmura apply to it. The korban yachidi, because it's a korban yachid. So you see clearly that in this brisa you have a par of the Yom Kippurim, which is a korban yachid. Proof being that it's oisa tmura, which means we're following, this brisa is following Rabbi Meir, who says that par Yom Kippurim is a korban yachid, and nonetheless, and it's oisa tmura. It's oisa tmura. See, Rabbi Lezer asked, according to Rabbi Meir, is the par Yom Kippurim oisa tmura, or do we view it as a par belonging to shutfim? Here you see clearly that it's oisa tmura. Omar of Sheshes. Rav Sheshes says no. It could be that this brisa is not talking about a chatos, it's talking about an oila. An oila is also yachid ketzibur. Sometimes it belongs to a yachid. Sometimes there's a concept of an oila of a yachid. Sometimes there's an oila of a tzibur. And these halachas would all apply. Which oila? He says loy. He says not talking about the power of the chatos. It's talking about be'eloi, with the ram shel Aaron, that the Kohen Gadol brings a ram on Yom Kippur, and this is actually a korban oila. And if it's a korban oila, then again, all these halachas apply, that it's a completely korban yachid, but it's got a fixed time. It has to be brought on Yom Kippur. That's why it overrides Shabbos and Tumah, but it's a korban yachid. Korban yachid is oisa tmura. And the Gemara says, Hachanam mistabra. I'll even bring you proof, says Rav Sheshes, that we must be talking here about the oila, not the chatos. If you're going to say that this brisa is talking about the chatos, the power of the Yom Kippurim, the power of the Kohen Gadol, tmura de par, because what did we see? That there are these 6 attributes: yachid ketzibur, doicha Shabbos, doicha Tumah, oisa tmura, and that it's not chal on a Baal Mum Kavua. The Kedushas Haguf doesn't apply if it's got a fixed blemish, and when it's redeemed, it's allowed to be worked with and shorn. In contrast to Tmura, in Tmura, what are the 6 halachas? They do not apply of Yochid Karabim. They are not Doicha Shabbos. It is not Doicha Tumah. It cannot make Tmura, and they have Kedushas Haguf, even if it's a Baal Mum, and when you redeem it, then you're not allowed to work or share with it. But what do you see from the brisa? That the korban we're talking about here, that the zebach part, the original version of the original korban is doicha Shabbos and Tumah, and the tmura version is not doicha Shabbos and not doicha Tumah. But we can deduce from there that it's not doicha Shabbos. But it would seem that during the week, if it's not Shabbos, it's a Tumura korban, it can be offered up, it's a korban. So it says with Sheishes, if this korban were to be speaking about a chatos, then we have an issue that the halacha l'Moshe Messina we've already discussed. A chatos of a yochid, if niskapru baleim, we saw that on Amud Aleph, then the animal gets put to death. If it's meisu baleim, the animal gets put to death. There's another one, a third one, a tmuras chatos. A tmura of a chatos yochid is mesos. It's not allowed to be offered up. So Sheisha says, if this whole brayse is talking about a chatos, namely the power of the Yom Kippurim, the power of the Kohen Gadol, then how can you say that the original version of it, the Zevach version, is Doicha Shabbos, and the Tzmura version is not Doicha Shabbos? It would seem it is Doicha, not Doicha, it is allowed to be brought the rest of the week. It's not. How can it be brought the rest of the week? It's a Tzmuras Chatos. If it's Tumuras Chatos, it has to be put to death. Hochanami mistabra disal kedaitach de poroi Tumura de par Shabbos v'tumahu de loidachia. You're going to deduce from this brisa that a Tumura version does not override Shabbos and Tuma ha b'choil, but during the weekdays makriv karva you're allowed to offer it up. Ha Tumuras Chatosi. But if you were to say that this whole brisa is talking about the Chatos, it's a Tumuras Chatos or Tumuras Chatos lemisa ozli. You have to kill it. You cannot offer it up. So Sheisha says that's proof that the Zevach we're talking about here is talking about the Oila. If it's talking about an Oila, it's an original Korban Yochid. And there's nobody would entertain the idea that Eloi Shel Aaron, the kind, this ram, has got anything to do with Shutfin or anything. It's a Korban Oila. And therefore you would have no proof from here to verify the discussion of Rabbi Lazar. According to Rabbi Meir, the power of Yom Kippurim, can it do Tmura or not? Says the Gemara, no. La'olam, it could well be not like Rav Sheisha said. It could well be that we're talking about Poroi. This whole brayse is talking about the Korban Chatos, the power of the Yom Kippurim of the Kohen Gadol. You can ask me a question that it's very good that the 6 halachas of the original power, that works very well. Yochid Ketzibur, Doicha Shabbos, Doicha Tumah, Oisa Tmura, Chol al Balmum Kavua, and it doesn't have the Chumrah that it's Chol on a Balmum Kavua, and it doesn't have the Chumrah of Eina Yotze Ligozes and Velavoid. All that is fine. When it comes to the Tmura version, there you had a question. How can you say that it's not Doicha Shabbos, but it can be brought the rest of the week? You say it's a Tmuras Chatos, and it has to be Mesos? No. He says, Umay Tmura, Shem Tmura. There's a fundamental difference between the way we read the Zevach version of these halachas and the way we read the Tmura version of these halachas. The Zevach version is talking about a single korban. Either, as we said before, either the power of the Yom Kippurim, which conforms with all these 6 halachas, or the Ayil, the Oila of the Kohen Gadol, which conforms to all these 6 halachas. However, the Tmura, it doesn't have to be talking about any particular korban. It just means that in the concept of Tmura, all the 6 points that apply to the original version of whichever animal we're talking about, in the concept of Tmura, they never apply. The original version is Yochid Ketzibur. There's no such thing as Tmura by a Tzibur. Doicha Shabbos, Tmura is never Doicha Shabbos. Doicha Tumah, Tmura is never Doicha Tumah. Oisa Tmura, Tmura is never Oisa Tmura, etc. So, but don't deduce that if it's not Doicha Shabbos, but it can be brought during the week. Well, some Tmurais can be brought during the week, and some Tmurais cannot be brought during the week. But none of the Tmurais can be brought on Shabbos. So when it says in the Brisa here that by Zevach, Choymer de Zevach, is that it's Doicha Shabbos, and by Tmura it's not Doicha Shabbos, that's always true, that it's not Doicha Shabbos. Sometimes it can be brought during the week, sometimes not. What does it depend on? Depends which korban it is. If it's a chatos, it cannot be brought even during the week, because a Tmuras chatos is lemisa ozla. If it's not a chatos, if it's an oila or any other korban, then by the Tmura it cannot be brought on Shabbos, it can be brought during the week. So when it comes to Tmura, we're not talking about the same korban as the Zevach. That means if the Zevach is talking about Porei Shel Yom Kippurim, that doesn't mean that all these 6 halachas of Tmura in their original way it's said apply to the Tmura of a par of Yom Kippurim or the Ayil of Yom Kippurim. And therefore, the proof of Rav Sheshes has been refuted. If so, says the Gemara, if the Tumura just means that all Tumurais, these 6 halachas apply, but it doesn't have to be any one particular korban, proof being that if the Zevach is talking about a chatos, then as far as the Tumura is concerned, it cannot be brought even during the week. If it's an oila, it can be brought during the week. If you're going to say that on the Tumura's part, say the same on the Zevach. Say chomer b'Zevach. Yeah, there's lots of halachas by all sorts of korbanos. Who says we have to be talking about one particular korban? All regular korbanos are yachid ketzibur, doicha Shabbos, doicha Tumah, oisa Tumura, etc. All these 6 halachas, why do you have to look for one particular korban that conforms with all these 6 halachas? Either the power of the Kohen Gadol or the ayil of the Kohen Gadol. Why do you need that? Because why did we have to say it's either the power or the ayil? Because we need it to be a korban yochid, because it's oisa Tumura, and we need it to have a fixed time that is doicha Shabbos and Tumah, and that's only the power or the ayil of Yom Kippur. We'll soon see there's going to be a third example, but for now, it's either the power or the ayil of Yom Kippur. But why do you have to go into that trouble? Just say it's talking about Shem Zevach. The concept of Zevach has these 6 halachas. Sometimes it's doicha Shabbos and Tumah if it's a korban tzibur. Sometimes it's oisa Tumura if it's a korban yochid. Why do you have to find a single korban which conforms with all of them? Ihachi zevach nami shem zevach. Answers the Gemara, no. Shem zevach loy katoni. It cannot be that when it comes to zevach, the zevach part of the halachas that is talking about the general concept of korbanos. Mimai. And I'll tell you why. Because it's not true. It's not true that all these 6 halachas apply general korbanos. Midiktoni chomer b'tmura. Since you said that one of the stringencies of tmura is shatmura chol al balmum kavua ve'ena yotze l'chol nigazis v'laved. The 2 stringencies of tmura is that they can be kadosh kedushas haguf, even if they have a mum kavua before it, or when one redeems it, they cannot be used for work or for shearing. Yitzchok, if you're going to say that my zevach, because then what would that mean? That means those are the 2 stringencies of Tumura that do not apply by zevach, which means by korbanos, these 2 things don't apply. That means by regular korban, if it has a mum kavua, it will not become kodesh kedushas haguf, and if you redeem it, then it will be allowed to be used to be shorn and to work with it. That's what it says here, that the 2 stringencies of Tumura do not apply by korbanos. Is that true? And if you say that zevach just means all korbanos, any korban, there's 2 korbanos that this doesn't apply to. It's not true. That both regarding b'choir, which is the firstborn animal, and the maisa, which is every 10th animal that gets counted, the cholin al balmum kavua, they share this stringency. Even the original b'choir and maisa share the stringency with Tumura, even though it's zevach. But the kedusha of kedushas haguf applies, even if it's a balmum kavua. And they do not become chulin when you redeem them. You're not even allowed to redeem them at all. Elo shem zevach loy katoni. It must be that shem zevach is a single animal, a single type of korban, that these 6 halachas do apply to them, not as a generalization. Umaish not Tumura. And when you're now talking about why did the Brisa choose that zevach should be a particular korban and Tumura is not a particular korban, says the Gemara, because shem Tumura achasi. Zevach ikka b'choir v'ikka maisa. And the Gemara explains as follows. Regarding the zevach, the original korban, there are many different types of korbanos. And most korbanos, these 2 stringencies don't apply to them. And the kedushas haguf does not apply if they have a mum kavua and they can be redeemed. And that doesn't apply to b'choir or maiser. So when it speaks about zevach, it must be talking about a particular korban. However, Tumura is not necessary, because these 6 halachas, they are always true in every single case of Tumura. In every case of Tumura, it's not tzibur k'yochid, it's not doicha Shabbos, it's not doicha Tumah, it's not oisa Tumura. It is chal, even on a mum kavua, and it is That means with Tmura, it's okay to say that these 6 always apply to any Tmura. So we don't need to pinpoint a particular type of korban, because any korban, the Tmura of it, these 6 apply. Even though we deduced that from the Zevach is Deicha Shabbos and the Tmura is not Deicha Shabbos, and we said Tmura is not Deicha Shabbos, but it can be brought during the week. Can it be brought during the week? Not if it's a Chatos. Now we said it doesn't matter. Part of the Tmura halachas will apply absolutely to other korbanos, sometimes to Chatos, sometimes not. But with Tmura we can talk about the bracket called Tmura where these 6 halachas apply. With the regular korbanos, you cannot make a rule for korbanos because there are different types of korbanos with different rules and different halachas. And therefore, when it comes to Zevach, the Brisa must have meant a particular korban. When it came to Tmura, it did not have to mean that. It could have been referring to all types of Tmura, and therefore it could well be that we're talking here about the power of Yom HaKippurim, and then you would have proof that the power of Yom HaKippurim, not like Rav Sheshes says, but the power of Yom HaKippurim is a korban yochid, which is Oiseh Tmura, which means we're following Reb Meir, and it's Oiseh Tmura. So Rabbi Loza asked, according to Reb Meir, is the power of Yom HaKippurim Oiseh Tmura? The answer is, on this brayso, it would seem that yes. And now the Gemara is asking that you, Rav Sheshes, wanted to refute the proof. We brought a proof here that you've got a brayso that's speaking about a korban yochid, which is manoi kavua, which is Oiseh Tmura. Here we have proof that power of Kohen Gadol on Yom Kippur is Oiseh Tmura. And you, Rav Sheshes, wanted to refute that by saying that the brayso might be talking about the ayil, the korban oil of the Kohen Gadol. Rav Sheshes, why did you have to go to the Isle of Aaron? I've got another example. You could have explained the brayso. Korban Pesach is also a korban yochid. It belongs to an individual, and also it has a fixed time. So the zevach in the brayso, which is Deicha Shabbos, Deicha Tumah, Oiseh Tmura, etc., all these halachas apply to korban Pesach as well. The Doicha is a Shabbos v'es Tumah because it has a fixed time. V'oiseh Tmura, the korban yochid too. So why didn't Rav Sheshes mention the korban Pesach? Answers the Gemara, Kasovar ein sheichatin a Pesach ala yochid. Because it could be that Rav Sheshes held that, according to the opinion, that we do not shech the korban Pesach for an individual. A single person on a korban Pesach, registered on a korban Pesach, we don't shecht it, and therefore there's always at least 2 owners. If there's at least 2 owners, it's shutfim. If it's shutfim, it's not Oiseh Tmura. So the brayso cannot be talking about that type of zevach. So why didn't he say this is the 4th type of korban, not Pesach Rishon, the Pesach Sheni, where Pesach Sheni, even an individual, you would shecht a korban Pesach for him if you had to. Says the Gemara, Pesach Sheni midachi Tumah. The Pesach Sheni doesn't override Tumah. And over here in the brayso it says that the Zevach we're talking about overrides Tumah. And the Korban Pesach Sheni does not override Tumah. Therefore, the only other option we have besides for the power of Yom Kippurim is the ayil. And that's why Rav Sheshes refuted the proof by saying that the brayso could be speaking about the ram of the Kohen Gadol, the Korban Oila. And in Mirz Hashem, we're going to continue here in the next shiur.